You want to give some stragglers a couple minutes?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's still just slightly. I just don't like to wait till right at 7 to find out if something didn't work.
Still says 3 minutes over here.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's going to take a little bit of
Yep.
back time. There it goes. Where's the microphone?
On the camera thing.
That's
The
like
Logitech.
good microphone.
Yeah. Actually, it is. On the Hangout, I can see the audio level.
Oh, that's good. Just attended a remote conference week before last, and all the presentations, you couldn't hear anything. It was just this, you know, they were using a cheap speakerphone or something. Very bad experience.
Yeah, that's the worst.
I think it's pretty hard to attend a workshop. You know, a presentation is not so bad, but an actual workshop, different people talking, is pretty difficult, you know, this sort of setting, unless you've actually got a dedicated teleconferencing facility.
Yeah. We use GoToMeeting typically, and we have tons of problems with it. It crashed twice today. I don't know the calls.
We use Hangouts quite a bit, and they work pretty well.
Yeah.
We used to have a system from, I think it was from Xerox, but Newbridge Networks, and it had the dedicated conferencing board, and it had the camera, and the camera would move around and try to move around the speakers. Dual DSL. This was several years ago. It was pretty fast. It was dual, what was it before DSL? It was ISDN. Dual ISDN.
Oh, there's a word.
I think we're competing with vacation schedules tonight.
It's possible.
Yeah.
It is possible. I think I'll go ahead and fire it up. Messages. Text. We're showing it.
All right.
All right, this is the DC JBug, JBoss User Group meetup, and tonight we're going to have a presentation from Steve Sorbat from Application Dynamics on AppDynamics, which is a pretty cool tool that's particularly useful for monitoring and discovery. And I'm not a pro at it. Steve's going to tell us a lot more about it. But the main thing is the idea of discovery, and I think that's pretty cool as to some of the value in it. So, given all that, Steve, you can take it, and you can either stand and talk, or we can jump right to your desktop, whichever you like.
All right. Well, I'm going to stand. I sit all day long.
All right.
So I'm going to put everybody on the spot and ask you to let everyone know who you are, what you do, and why you came to this JBoss Users Group. Free pizza, perfectly acceptable. Where do you get started?
Oh. Well, hello, I'm Luis, and I came here to learn about AppDynamics by influence of my dad. He's a high schooler, and he's learning how to program in Python, so
Awesome.
it's a good thing.
I think this is a great way to learn and see what people are doing, and you know, if everybody got started at that young age, you'll probably have a great head start.
That's exactly what I think. My name is Abel Cabrera. I work for the National Cancer Institute. I am a contractor. Well, I work full time for SRA International, and I do administrate the HP site scope, monitoring thousands of servers and thousands of switches, and also this is right in my alley.
Do you do any application monitoring right now?
Yes.
A little bit?
Yes.
What
yes,
do you what do you guys use? Do you use SiteScope? Anything else?
SiteScope. There is Nagios, and there is NetSite,
Okay.
and a couple other things. I'm new to the company, and the crisis was for HP SiteScope.
Yeah.
So that's why they brought me in.
Okay.
So,
okay, great. So I think you'll probably see a lot of differences between HP SiteScope is kind of on the legacy side of monitoring, very infrastructure focused, and I think that you'll see AppDynamics takes a very different approach to how we do application and performance management.
and we're studying, maybe the next tool or so.
Yeah.
It's always good to keep up
Yeah, absolutely.
learning what's going on.
Okay.
I'm Jim McCracken. I'm with AppDynamics. I'm one of the sales and biz dev guys here in the Atlanta area, focused on commercial accounts. So fall into that category, either here in the room or on the phone, and you want some information, talk afterwards. But I'm particularly interested in this because I have a couple clients who are implementing OpenShift and really drove our development of a cartridge for that. So I'm here to hear what Steve has to say about that.
I'm Adrian Tarquinio, Jim's counterpart with AppDynamics on the sales side. I'm actually interested to learn more about OpenShift because it's somewhat newer to me.
Okay.
I'm Chris Kaczmarek. I'm with Applied Engineering Management Corporation. I'm on the federal side, not the Missouri side.
Okay.
And we are actually using AppDynamics in our production environment, and we're in the process of installing it into our test environment.
Very good. Any positive words to say before we get kicked off?
No, not yet.
He said positive.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, pretty similar to Chris. So ADM and we're working on the same platform application.
Okay.
And we're starting to configure AppDynamics. So that's why we don't have feedback yet.
Oh, okay. It's not that you don't have any positive feedback, it's that you haven't really done it yet. Okay.
We're not the ones doing it, yet, so
Okay.
that's the IT.
Okay.
As a account focus over for Missouri, which is a division of Applied Engineering Management. I'm a consultant SA, and I've installed AppDynamics for a couple of our clients. Hanging out.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool. Kurt Calvin. I work on the SLA project. We have lots of JBoss application servers. Performance management or performance monitoring is a big issue with us.
Okay.
For internal applications as well as vendor-side applications, see how they perform.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm familiar with OutNet's
Okay.
architecture, so I'm very curious what your approach is versus that.
Okay.
David Coyle, I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and we're running about 10 servers in production, running Glassfish, MySQL, and similar to your case, with performance monitoring is kind of a 24-hour concern with keeping things going. So that's why I'm here.
Okay. All right, great. So I'll introduce myself in a second, but I wanted to thank you guys all for coming out. I know it's kind of after hours time, and after being in front of computers all day, sometimes it's a big deal to come out and participate after hours. So thanks. And this is, I've presented at a few JBoss User Groups before, and it's a very informal process. We're here to kind of share some information about what we do. Hopefully it'll be valuable. Probably things that you haven't seen before, maybe some things that you have seen. But if there's stuff you want to drill into, there's so many things that we could talk about, and I've kind of got a presentation plan. But if you see something and have questions, chime in. It's meant to be interactive for sure. Okay.
You want me to switch to desktop? Presentation to you, or do you want me to?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to switch to the desktop, or do you want to go with the camera?
If you, I don't know how to switch to the desktop, but I'm happy to
transfer
do that.
to you. So
Okay.
now go to sharing. From the upper left, I think.
Okay.
see, where is that? Up here. Screen share. There you go. And pick whichever window you want to serve. Probably the Hangout. This one, or actually your desktop. The other one is actually the. Now let's go to just show the camera. Let's go that. Let's go back again. Let's pick whichever window it is. Where's that? Yeah, screen share. Which window is your or desktop is your presentation? Slide down.
It's their
Sure. So the desktop, right? Oh, yeah, I think so. Okay. Yep. Okay.
Yep, that's got it.
Okay. So we're obviously going to talk about performance management, and it's presentation is more about performance management in the cloud. We use OpenShift as a kind of a reference platform for doing that. We will talk about the AppDynamics OpenShift cartridge, and we can talk about some of the concerns specifically and how AppDynamics and Red Hat complement each other to give you really a full deployable production-ready solution. I will tell you that I am not the end-all be-all experts on OpenShift itself, so if you really want to go deep into that area, those are probably questions that are best taken offline. This is really focused on the performance management side of the platform as opposed to developing on OpenShift. Okay, so I appreciate you guys letting us know why you're here. I am Steve Sturdivant, and I work for AppDynamics on the pre-sale side. I'm on the engineering side of the house. I have been a software and performance engineer for almost just about 14 years now, give or take. And most of my time I spent on the other side of the house, outside of the sales side. So technically I'm on the sales team, but in an engineering capacity. I was in DC for a long time, and I worked on a lot of federal projects under Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security. We worked on very big projects for Customs and Border, modernizing their cargo importing systems. And both as a software engineer as well as a performance engineer, I was also the product manager of RTI, if you guys are familiar with OC Systems. And about 2 years ago, my family decided, mainly I decided, and I encouraged my wife to decide that it was time to get out of DC and avoid the horrendous commutes from Gainesville into Tyson's Corner. And so we live in Austin, Texas now. Yeah, you're laughing. It was terrible.
It's only gotten better.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, we had a house in the area until 4 months ago. So we finally cut all ties. But I've worked with Missouri in the past when I was with RTI. So it was a good opportunity to come out and share this presentation with you guys. Before coming over to AppDynamics, I was in charge of performance engineering for PayPal's middleware platforms. So that PayPal has a huge presence up in Austin. There's about 600 of us. We did most of their middleware development there in that office. So all of their, not the actual products, but we ran JBoss, we didn't run Glassfish, we ran IBM Geronimo, there was Python, there was PHP, a very heterogeneous, very complex environment. And that was kind of my project while I was there. And then I came over to AppDynamics in February. And the reason that I made the switch was because when we were at PayPal, we were very successful using AppDynamics in a pre-production role. So performance engineering that I did was largely in pre-production when I was at PayPal. And I've always been very impressed with the technology and with the company. When I was in the product management side of the house, we competed against AppDynamics all the time. And the flow maps and the technology and the way we do things was just always just above and beyond what other people were doing. So it was a great opportunity to kind of come in and focus on doing that kind of stuff full time and getting to talk with lots of different customers about performance problems. So before I can tell you how AppDynamics monitors your application, I think it's important to kind of set the stage for why you would want to do that in the first place. Right? So we talk to a lot of people about the software-defined business, and what we mean by that is organizations and businesses who fundamentally deliver their value proposition through software. And so a couple examples. You think about Blockbuster. Blockbuster used to be the de facto place to go rent movies. And Blockbuster doesn't exist anymore. Netflix has not just degraded their business, they've completely put them out of business. And while it's great that you can rent and experience and consume movies from Netflix, fundamentally their value proposition is the software. that they build. They're a technology company first, and a movie rental business second. Barnes & Noble, I'm sorry, Borders. So Borders, back in the day, actually outsourced their e-commerce platform to Amazon. They said, I don't think this web thing is going to be all that big of a deal, right? Gone. And fundamentally, Amazon is a place, they're a technology shop. They're a software company first. They've got thousands of developers. If their technology is not available, if their software is not available, their business is not available, right? So the ability and the need to monitor their systems, like you said, 24/7, performance management and monitoring is a 24/7 concern. And if your code, if your technology is not available, your business is not available. So there's a very real link between making money and ensuring the performance and availability and health of your technology. Another customer that we're working with quite a bit that you wouldn't necessarily consider to be a software-defined business, but Union Pacific Railroads. They're a software company with a railroad problem, right? They have over 3,000 developers sitting in Omaha, Nebraska, that are working on defining what that business is. They're fundamentally a software company first, with railroads, with cars. If their software, if their technology is not available, their business is not available. So, and when we think about monitoring, we think about building systems. This was an observation that John Martin, he was the senior director of Edmunds.com. He was doing an interview with Forrester. Forrester and Gartner are the two most respected independent analyst firms. And what he said was, that it's great, developers and organizations, they can build these elaborate systems. But what we're seeing is that they are developed kind of under the premise that things always work. And as the complexity starts to increase, as things leverage more commercial off-the-shelf components, more open source components, our sophistication, our complexity grows. And when things don't work, it becomes very difficult to figure out what's going on.
Steve, I'll join in, but if you don't mind, an experience that I've noticed and observed several times at our companies, and that is, it isn't just that it doesn't work, it's that there's a reduced performance, meaning your system might be up, but if your users start to experience poor performance, you may lose them pretty quickly, and if you do, they may not ever come back. And if delivering a bad experience doesn't necessarily mean it isn't available. It may mean that it's so slow that it's not working. So what's different now than prior periods? And that's just as important, I think, as it is to throw this up and function.
Right, absolutely. And with companies that are delivering their business through software, there's very few industries where you have a truly captive audience. And so if your business, if your software, if your technology is not only is it available, if it's not performant, your users go somewhere else. If it takes me 30 seconds to buy something on Amazon, I'm going to go to eBay, and vice versa. So everything is competitive, and having that user experience is extremely important, as well as does the functionality actually work. So this is one of John's observations, and I think he's right on the money. But still, when we go and talk to people, sometimes they say, well, we don't experience this, we don't have these problems. And I say, yeah, but you will, right? If you haven't yet, you will, right? And so when you have them, and you think about these guys, did anybody here work on healthcare.gov? I was debating putting the slide in because it's kind of close to home here.
That was CGI right down the street there.
Yeah.
I hope they got a big blackout.
Their offices are probably smaller now.
Yeah. So,
I got a job because of healthcare.
What's that?
You got
a job?
IRS needed to test the Affordable Care Act.
Okay.
And so they were so scared about healthcare.gov that they actually paid me a lot of money to make sure their system was ready for performance.
I feel like my job security has gone up from this. As people that work in the performance industry, this is a tough one because healthcare.gov is not the only example of this happening. The reality is that when online systems, when transactional systems, high transactional, highly concurrent systems fail with performance or capacity, reasons at fault, they typically don't fail in a little way. They fail in a very big way. This was obviously a very high-profile example. I was telling my wife, I'm pretty sure I hope that the president is never talking about the application that I'm working on. That's not something that I want to experience. But so things do go wrong. It's going to happen. Right? So okay, so let's talk about the cloud part of this presentation. So just to set the stage for people that may or may not, everybody comes into these from a different level of experience. And still sometimes people say, well, what really is a cloud? And it turns out that all a cloud is a computing model. So a cloud is not Amazon EC2, it's not Windows Azure, it's not OpenShift, it's a model for computing, right? It's about the ability to very quickly provision resources that you may or may not control on demand when you need them. And the reason that people are so rapidly going to the cloud, there's a lot of reasons, but this is a big one. So if you look at this model on your left, here's kind of a classic historical computing model, where as users, if you look at this diagonal line going up from left to right, it shows your load forecast. So if you're selling anvils, if you're Acme online, you're selling anvils to coyotes, this line shows the number of coyotes you expect to come onto your site and buy anvils over time. And so what you've traditionally had to do with your IT infrastructure, you've had to over-provision at every step. So you always have to have some amount of cushion. If I have 10 users, I need 12 servers, or whatever. If I have 100 users, I need 120 servers. You always have to have more infrastructure than you have users. And then what happens, though, is that when your users go away, you have all this over-provision capacity. And that's bad for a lot of reasons, not the least of which are not that, well, you still have to cool them, you still have to give them electricity, you're still paying for them, you have teams that are managing them. It's a real impact and degradation to the business. So from the cloud model, as your users grow, as more people come to your site to buy anvils, your environment elastically scales. So the black line is your users coming to buy anvils. So you see this big spike. I'm sorry, your blue line is your users. The black line is your IT environment. So your IT environment elastically scales to handle your user load. And then when your coyotes go away because they're out chasing roadrunners, your environment elastically scales down. So you don't have that over-provisioning issue. So it's very elastic, very on-demand. Infrastructure as a service, this is simply the ability to, the functionality for users to provision these resources. So when I can go to Amazon AWS, and I can very quickly provision a small virtual machine with 8 gigs of memory or whatnot, that's that infrastructure as a service. Where we're talking about OpenShift, so platform as a service versus infrastructure as a service, PaaS being the capability to automate the deployment of the application stacks. So infrastructure as a service, give me computing power, give me network, give me disk, give me the capability to host my applications. PaaS being give me the capability to deploy my application stacks elastically. So I'm a developer. What I want to do is I want to write code. I want to work in innovation, things that matter to the business. Do I really care about managing my JBoss container? I don't. I would really like to have something that I could just very quickly make a code change and then get that out as fast as possible. So at PayPal, we always talk about continuous release, continuous integration, being able to get your changes to market faster. Really, what can you do to streamline and create efficiencies of when you can develop something to when you can get it out to production? So PaaS is all about solving those types of problems, allowing your developers to do what they do best, which is work on solving business problems, innovations, and then very quickly getting it out to that environment. So APM, and this is almost our last definition. APM, application performance management, according to Gartner, is 5 things. And if you want to call yourself an APM solution, we were having somewhat of a discussion beforehand about, oh, AppDynamics, you guys compete with RTI, or you guys compete with some other platforms, and I said, we really don't compete with RTI. And the reason is that RTI is not an APM solution. So to be an APM solution, Gartner says you need 5 things. And you experiencing what pages are. This is transactions flow. This is the application architecture. What is that transaction path? Does it come through and hit a web tier? Does it flow through a backend services tier? What databases does it hit? Being able to dynamically discover the application environment. Very critical part of APM. User transaction profiling. So what are your users doing? Are they logging in those services? Are you providing services for users to get water quality data, for example? So things like login, checkout, add to cart, e-commerce type platforms. It could be service requests. But what are the transactions that are executing in your component deep dive monitoring? So you're in a cloud environment. Let's say you have 1,000 machines. Do you have the ability to deep dive on any one of those? Can you identify through the discovery that you have this very complex path? Then as things start to break down, you very quickly go to a deep dive mode and understand what the root cause defect is for your problem. And then finally, analytics and reporting. And so if you have all of this, then really what you have is application intelligence. And this is kind of, so technically, you want to be an APM solution, you need those 5 things. But the reason why people deploy AppDynamics and APM solutions is this. It's the ability to understand what's happening in very complex systems, to have clarity, to know what's going on at any given time, to understand, do I have issues? If I do have issues, where in my application are those problems occurring? What business impact, or what business function is impacted? So it's all about having very deep intelligence and clarity into your environment in near real time. Okay. So I know that was a lot of definitions, but I think it's important to understand kind of and have some agreement on those base terms before we can talk about how do we monitor those applications. So if you think about this being a kind of a legacy architecture, pretty simple. We work with tons of customers that still look like this, but a lot of the customers that look like this are in the process of going through transformations. Right? They're thinking about, well, maybe I want to go out to the cloud, or maybe I want to leverage a platform as a service capability. Maybe I want to start using, I don't want to write my own caching solution. I don't want to write my own proprietary solution. What other components can I start to take advantage of? How do I do things? And so, in this environment where maybe you've got a web server, you've got a backend services, you've got a database. It's not incredibly simple, but something happens. There's a small finite number of places where people can go and look and understand problems, right? And so it might take a little while, but it's not that bad. But the reality is people go through those transformations and those changes, the environment starts to look more and more like this. So you go from that huge monolithic code base to a very distributed architecture. You start to say, hey, what components can I leverage? I don't want to write my own caching solution. Let me look at memcached-db. You know what? We've got tons of data. Are there any big data solutions that I can take advantage of? What third party, what COTS, what open source kind of, who doesn't use open source in some capacity these days? Nobody reinvents the wheel, right? Or you shouldn't. If you go through technology acquisitions, if you've been acquired or you acquire technology, as companies start to integrate those pieces, if you've got ESBs in place to start to connect some of those services, what you end up with is very heterogeneous, complex, distributed environments. And this is just, this isn't driven by the cloud, but as people start to be more sophisticated in the way they architect and deploy their software, we see this happening more and more. I mentioned that PayPal started off as a 10 million source line of code application all written in C++, and it was deployed with the CGI model. And they had tons of performance problems all over the place. And they almost didn't care, because what they would do is they would serve some number of requests, and then they would kill the process, start up a new one, right? But as they started to modernize, it's very difficult to hire developers that can maintain 10 million lines of C++ code. It's not a maintainable platform. You can't innovate on 10 million lines of code. Just to build the application itself takes hours. So it's just not a realistic way of doing business in today's world. So what they started to see is as they started to kind of carve off some of these bits and pieces and migrate them over to Java, because it's a lot easier to hire a Java developer than it is to hire a C++ developer. But now you have Java processes, JBoss, that's up and running 24/7, right? And now you start to have these performance problems because you're not in a CGI model, right? You're running 24/7. Your memory leaks turn into crashes, turn into outages, right? And it starts to get very bad. And so this is very much a reality. We had PHP, we had Java, we had C++, we had Python, we had a little bit of Perl. we were very heavily migrating towards Node.js to be our web platform. And people were starting to look at alternative languages too. Akka, Scala, Play, Go. Just lots of very, very disparate technologies. Right? So it gets very hard to manage. And I think that this kind of covers all of those issues. Running in a cloud environment, access can be a real problem. If you don't control the system, lots of times you don't even have access to go in the box and figure out what's going on. If you've ever tried to hook Visual VM or JProfiler or a profiling tool up to an application that's running in the cloud, it's challenging. I was working with a customer, and one of their main wishes, which is on the very low side of what AppDynamics does, but they just wanted to be able to connect over JMX to their application, and they couldn't get JConsole or Visual VM to do it. It just wasn't possible. And so access and privileges are a real issue. And the tools that people are using in development, they're using the profilers, they're using Eclipse, they're using SDKs. They're just not the right tools when you go to high traffic environments. Even pre-production, if you're running performance tests, it's just not the right way to do it. Okay, so when we talk to people about APM, and we don't always get into this conference, but I think one of the things you want to get out of this is if you have an understanding of what AppDynamics can do, that's great, and I hope that you do get that out of tonight. The other thing I would think of is where are you in your maturity model? So you're working on a project, right, and you know that it's a software-defined business, meaning, hey, if your software goes down, your environment, your technology goes down, there is real business impact. So think about what is your ability to respond to those problems. So where on the maturity model are you in terms of your ability to be reactive? So level 0, and this is tons of people. So level 0 is you have no idea when something goes wrong. The only way that you find out is because your users call you, or whoever's interacting with your system ends up saying, hey, I'm trying to get this water quality data, I can't get it. And then developers say, I had no idea. That happened when the project that I was on, the US Customs, it happened all the time. They wouldn't know their system was down until the inspectors at the actual ports would call in and say, I can't log in, I can't do work. And when you're doing something like processing cargo that's coming into the country, that's not acceptable. They would literally have lines of tractor-trailer trucks that would line up at the border when the system went down. Right? And so that's millions of dollars of tariffs and taxes that we're losing because we're unable to process those trucks. Right? And so then at this point, people start saying, well, hey, let's go check the log files, or let's get the DBA, let's get the network guy. It's a just complete storm of, let's get anybody that could possibly help us solve a problem.
You mentioned the network guy. Maybe later on, can you describe how you can measure network latency and throughput from your endpoint monitoring?
Yep, definitely. Right. So this is level 0. Level 1, a little bit better. But so when a lot of times people get from level 0 to level 1, what they start to do is they either build a bunch of tools or they just start to procure a bunch of tools. And the tools have very limited scope, limited visibility. I've got a tool for monitoring CPU. I've got a tool for monitoring my JVM heap utilization. I've got a tool that I've written to monitor response time. I've written some Perl scripts to parse log files. But if you think about all the tools that you would need to put together to have a complete understanding of the system, nobody really has a sense for what those are, how do they work together. They're very clunky. Trying to get one person that has, okay, here's what's going on end to end, it just doesn't work. So this would be our goal, level 2. Instead of having an APM system available in your environment, this is what we feel like you're going to get out of the box. So the ability to understand when I have a problem. So I proactively know because I've got alerts. I can understand what business functionality was impacted. Users can't log in. I know when the degradation starts to happen specifically. As fixes are rolled out, I can very clearly see this is the root cause failure, or this is the source line of code for my degradation. And as fixes are rolled out, I have visibility to know that I've solved the problem. So, is that application of intelligence or clarity into the environment. And then finally, level 3, so kind of at the top of this maturity model, this is where you even go above and beyond that proactive recognition, and you start to incorporate things like auto remediation. And so this is something that we can do as well, is taking those operational policies, those playbooks. So a lot of organizations have very big operational playbooks. When this happens, do this. If this happens, call this guy. If I get above 95% heap utilization, recycle the JVM. Starting to roll some of those operational policies into your APM platform. So having AppDynamics do things like, hey, this JVM's 95% utilized, and my policy is that I want to recycle the JVM. So have AppDynamics do that for me. Have an alert that understands my threshold has been crossed, recycle the JVM without having to get an operator involved. And so even that time that it's taken to receive an alert, get an operator in the system, recycle the JVM, get approval, you've now cut out that time completely. So this is a very mature way of doing business. Right? And also understanding business impact. This is something that some of our customers are doing, leveraging the instrumentation to get insight into business metrics. So seeing things like, we've got one of the world's largest online movie ticket sales companies, and they look per minute what their, how many tickets they're selling, what is their revenue. And as the system degrades, or maybe it becomes unavailable, they can very clearly understand, hey, it went down at 12 o'clock, it came back up at 12:10. This was the dollar impact. This was the business impact to that degradation, to that outage. Okay, so that's kind of an overview to to the cloud. I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of that stuff before, and APM in general. And so now what we're going to get into is the specifics of enabling AppDynamics in an OpenShift environment. So one of the tenets, fundamental principles of AppDynamics is to be extremely easy. We like to think that we've kind of changed the game from some of the legacy providers. So when you're using HP SiteScope or some of the infrastructure components, maybe you could share some experiences about, are the tools difficult to configure? Does it take some amount of time to go from having nothing installed to having some level of infrastructure monitoring?
Well, I got there where they already have it configured, and they have a total of maybe 7,000 servers, 70% Linux, 80%, the other percent, 30% of Windows, and some of the boxes. So it's already configured. It has a lot of alerts, pagers, but it's really bulky. To make changes, it does take a lot of time.
Yeah.
There is some application monitoring. I guess you could say I'm new to that company. My prior career was actually performance engineer. I've been a performance engineer many years.
Okay.
But I guess my perception is we need to move to the next level of more proactiveness.
Yeah.
And you talk about the dashboard, that's where we want to be.
Yep.
That's some of the things that they are looking for me to do.
Okay, all right. So I'll share one of my experiences. When I was at US Customs, I was in charge of a project to deploy end-to-end transaction monitoring across the customs enterprise, which was this was 10 years ago, and that was kind of cutting edge at the time. So what we wanted to do was, from the time an inspector clicked within a Java applet, start a transaction, trace that across the WAN, trace that transaction through all of the distributed backends in the system, and be able to diagnose pretty close down to the first line of code where the problem went. It took us about a year to do that. So that's a lot of time, right? The opportunity cost, all the outages, all the all the times the application wasn't available during that year. It's mind-boggling. And so these days we do that in about an hour, maybe a couple hours, depending on the complexity of the environment. So you're talking about a shift from having to have a team of people working on putting code into the application, testing the code. How do I get transaction correlation across HTTP, across RMI, across this protocol, and to a model now where APM solutions are providing that capability out of the box. So it's very different. And the cartridge that you have within OpenShift makes a lot of that extremely easy to use. So how many people have used OpenShift so far? Doug? Okay. So
See, I was going to point out one thing, by the way, and that is not just monitoring your production environment, but monitoring your test environment or your QA environment, meaning you could test the deployment and see if anything changed. Deployment to you could monitor your test or QA environment to see if anything's changed enough to warrant not putting it into production. So it isn't, monitoring shouldn't just be viewed as a production quality type thing. It also becomes a canary type thing as to in a test or QA situation as to whether something is different enough to potentially be an issue. Sorry, I didn't.
No, you're right on. I mean, that's absolutely.
How can you, with the AppDynamics, how can you measure latency? Like, in my mind, the only way to measure latency at the application level, let's say from a single page application or whatever, would be if you actually send down the amount of server think time needed. Let's say the server took 20 milliseconds to process the request. You know that at the server, it started sending back the response after 20 milliseconds, and you know the time. So then, at the client side, now you can take those two pieces of information and calculate the network latency.
Okay.
Is that something like what AppDynamics does? And if not, how do you do that?
Yeah, so we've got kind of 3 levels of monitoring. We've got end user experience, we've got application, and we've got database.
Yeah, I guess I would be talking end user experience.
Right.
Not
So
to mention network problems.
So what I was going to go through doesn't go into end user experience. I was a little bit focused on how do you enable AppDynamics in an OpenShift world, how do you leverage the cartridge, which is more about monitoring on the application side, so in the data center. But from an end user experience, I can kind of highlight some of that at the end.
Okay.
The end user experience solution that we roll out uses JavaScript instrumentation. So we embed a little snippet of JavaScript into the page that is returned to the user. And it does a couple of things, but primarily it works with the majority of browsers implement what's called the navigation timing API. It's a specification for how browsers deliver performance information, things like what page is being looked up or requested, how long did it take, and very finite or very granular data too. How long did it take to do a DNS lookup on the URL host name? And so we leverage that to get a lot of very granular performance data about the individual pages, what the end user experience is, and then you can do geolocation on the IP address to say I've got this user coming from, I can get down to, we can hit pages from the office and say, okay, I've got users in Herndon that are doing requesting these pages. Here's what their experiences are.
Okay, sounds good.
So in OpenShift, and we can kind of walk through the console and walk through a quick example. Basically, what you do is you say, I want a application that's going to be built in JBoss, and then OpenShift goes out and it creates the resources needed for you to do that. It creates a JBoss instance, and it pre-configures JBoss with reasonable settings, so that all you have to do is then take your application code and just say go, essentially, and you can say go with a couple different methods. Is everybody or anybody? Are you guys using Git at all?
I think we're all familiar with OpenShift.
Okay.
I am.
Okay, great. So you can leverage, so within OpenShift, AppDynamics has a cartridge where we can very quickly take an existing OpenShift application and we can say enable this cartridge, recycle the application once, and now you've got an APM solution without having to do anything. When you have the AppDynamics cartridge, what it's going to do under the covers, it's going to connect to an AppDynamics controller. So if you wanted to get, after this, if you say, hey, this looks pretty cool, I'd like to give this a shot, you can either let us know, or you can even go online and download do this yourself. You can download AppDynamics. You can get a free self-service trial. We have a controller that would be run somewhere. You could run it in OpenShift. Lots of people would put it on a dedicated server, a dedicated box. But the AppDynamics cartridge is going to collect performance data about your application and send it down to the AppDynamics controller. Those are the only two pieces in our monitoring architecture. We've got an agent, which is enabled through our cartridge. We've got a controller that collects data. And the agent sends data to the controller over HTTP or HTTPS. There's one port that gets open, so typically port 8090 out of the box, and the agent's always going to be sending traffic across that link. So let's go and take a look at, since you guys have all done OpenShift, Everybody see that? Or should I make it bigger? Everybody see that? All right, so here's my application. So what I did was I created a new OpenShift project from an existing Git repository. It's got a small VM. I marked it as I wanted it to be scalable. Does everybody know what all of that means, or is it worth going? Should I go into that? No? Okay. So I want it to be scalable. OpenShift fires up my application. It's immediately available. So right now I have my application up and running, but I don't have any monitoring for it. So my next step would be to say, I want to get monitoring for my application. I've created a couple of helper scripts, so let's see. Okay, so what cartridges do I have? So I've got my AppDynamics JBug domain. I've got one gear. I've got an HA proxy because I'm a scalable app, right? And then I've got my JBoss AS7 cartridge. Are there any questions about what this is? Does this make sense so far? I know this is, if you're OpenShift guys, this is easy stuff. Okay, so what would I want to do? So this is just a helper script, but to enable AppDynamics, I like to do it through the console. So RHC, I'm going to add a cartridge to my application called JBoss Tickets, and then I'm going to pass in a couple of environment variables. I'm going to pass in the controller hostname, which I've got. So AppDynamics is deployable either you can run it in our SaaS environment or on-premise. So the controller hostname is the server name of my controller. What port am I talking to? I'm going to use HTTPS, so port 443. What do I want to call the tier? So in AppDynamics, we have a concept of applications, tiers, and nodes. But an application typically is all the processes within your environment that talk to each other. So if you've got a highly distributed service-oriented architecture, it would be everything that kind of works together to provide that function, those transaction requests. So within an application, you'll have multiple tiers. Maybe you have a web tier, maybe you have a couple of services tiers, you've got some back-end databases. Each one of those things, those logical grouping of JVMs would be a tier. And then a node name in the AppDynamics world would be mapped to a single JVM. So if you have a cluster of JVMs that comprise your web tier, right? Each JVM in the web tier would be a node. My account name, so this is related to my SaaS environment. If you guys are running in AppDynamics SaaS environment, you'll get an access key, which is like a password display. Don't steal my password. And then here, we're going to say, here's the AppDynamics JBoss cartridge. Give it a pointer to the manifest YAML. And that's it. So you can take this enable script, plug in your relevant information. So let's see. So here's my application in OpenShift. Right? It's currently started. It's got JBoss AS7. It's got my HA proxy. And if I run this, and it's going to take a second. So in the meantime, what I'm going to do is fire up my load test. So the application that I'm using is JBoss Ticket Monster. It's one of the Red Hat's reference applications for the Java developer framework. Has anybody seen that before? Yeah, it's a reasonable, just reference application to use. We certainly didn't write it. If you go to I'll give you guys the link to my GitHub repository. I've got a JMeter performance test there. It'll generate a very reasonable performance test for that application. So you can see. Okay, so I've started to send some traffic through here. All the transactions that I'm running. There's a bunch of REST services. You can see I've got a mix of 200s, 400s, 404s, 500s, so lots of different traffic in the environment. At this point, my cartridge is now enabled. So you can see I've got scaling here, all the application environment variables that I've set. Now if I jump back to OpenShift, there's my AppDynamics cartridge. Okay, so that's how hard it is to enabled. Took about a minute on Wi-Fi.
Where is that running?
I'm sorry?
Is that running on the cloud or on your machine?
Which part?
The application.
So the application, this is running on OpenShift Online. So the application?
On the Amazon or whatever.
No, it's the cloud, OpenShift.
OpenShift cloud.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's the Ticket Monster application.
Okay.
You can do things like buy tickets to events and look up to see what bookings there are.
This might be a little bit off point, but can you fine-tune the HA proxy configuration, or you just have to live with what OpenShift gives you?
You can manually change it.
Okay.
How is the agent? Is the agent listening to the network to get all this information?
The agent is bootstrapped into the application. So we collect network performance metrics, but we are an agent that essentially runs as part of the application. So we're using AppDynamics supports Java.NET, PHP, and Node.js. In a Java world, we are using a mixture of bytecode instrumentation and some other tricks to discover what's happening in your environment.
Are you installing anything in the JBoss app server?
The cartridges. So if you go and let's take a look. So let's SSH in. So I'm beating on it with my JMeter script, so I think it's running a little slow. Let's see if I can stop that for a second. Okay, so what happens under the covers, and actually I didn't do one thing, I didn't recycle the application. So I'll go. It'll take a second to do this. So after you enable the cartridge, the next thing you would have to do is bounce your application one time. So we'll stop it, we'll restart it again. But essentially what we're doing is we're adding an agent, a jar file, into the boot path of the application. Yep. Okay, so once that happens, this is some pre-recorded data. So once your application is enabled for monitoring by AppDynamics, we discover basically what's happening under the covers. So we see we've got a tier. We named it tier called tickets, and you can see there are 2 nodes under tickets. So what's actually right now there are 3. So what's happening under the covers is as I fired off my load test, and as I'm simulating multiple concurrent users coming to the site, OpenShift is deciding to spin up and down gears for me. So they're spinning up additional gears to handle the load. And as they're spinning up gears, because AppDynamics is enabled, I just get monitoring coverage out of the box. It just works. So in a very elastic environment where I've got a lot of stuff that's being brought up, being brought down, I don't have to do anything. AppDynamics is automatically configured.
Is there one instance of the controller running then, and where is that instance running?
Yeah, so there's always one instance of the controller. So our model is client server, the client being our agent. The agent is always connecting to a central controller. The controller can be installed in your data center on premise. This particular controller is running in the AppDynamics SaaS environment. So we support both models. So if you want to use AppDynamics, we'll host it for you, we'll manage it for you, or you can take the controller and install it yourself. Works 100% the same.
It's interesting monitoring a scaling situation because you could see OpenShift or whomever scale up, and you can evaluate whether it was really necessary or not. You may want to tune it. So you could see the scale up event occur, you could see the automatic collection of extra monitoring, and then see what the user experience shows and decide that you really didn't need to scale up, that you could tweak the scaling, the elasticity aspect of it, down slightly or up slightly, whatever. and save your money. That's the whole point behind that, is that you're seeing what the user experience actually shows, not just the fact that it's going to scale up at 75% CPU or something like that.
Yeah, and you know, cloud providers very typically have some level of monitoring available, but it's very infrastructure based. And you know, there's lots of reasons why infrastructure monitoring is not a very good proxy for understanding what your users are experiencing. Lots of people run their CPUs by design at 95% and say, that's just what I want to do. You can't look at CPU utilization and tell whether or not your business is available. It could be at 5% and you have no ability to serve transactions. So what OpenShift is deciding to do to create that elastic environment is it's looking at the box at numbers of connections to my HA proxy. So once I cross a certain threshold, then the proxy says, hey, I must be able to, I've got a sudden burst for whatever I'm serving. Let me scale up some new gears. All right, so that's a very infrastructure-focused way of deciding whether or not I want to scale. But with AppDynamics, we can integrate with that elastic engine to say, let's use application performance data as a trigger point or as a decision point to scale the environment. So let's use my end user experience as a trigger point. Maybe I want to scale the environment when my end user experience starts to degrade outside of what's normal, right? So rather than just looking at the infrastructure, let's actually use application and business information to kind of scale that environment. So what we did as we started to drive load through is AppDynamics discovered that there was a tickets tier. So we see these REST indications hit in JBoss. We can see, are there 2 nodes, are there 3 nodes, how many nodes are in the environment, what backend systems are we hitting. This is a very simple application. It has 1 tier, 2 backend databases. Let's take a look at maybe a little more complex environment. So how about something like this? So you've got an e-commerce, a web front end, and it talks across ActiveMQ to your mid-tier order processing service, and then it calls directly into an inventory service. So as your environment starts to be more complex, as you start to get more distributed, the same discovery process applies. So we see transactions coming in e-commerce, and we know the fact that e-commerce talks across ActiveMQ. We see these transactions going to downstream tiers. We see all of the backend data repositories. So when you have a problem, it's very easy for us now to say, I've got these business transactions in the environment. Here's what my users are doing. They're hitting the home page, they're logging in, they're running fetch catalog. Here's the experience or the scoring of each transaction. Let's take a look at the checkout transaction.
So how do you discover those business transactions?
So we have a lot of intelligence built into the agent to say, here are the ways the transactions come into the application. They come in, they're hitting servlets, there's REST calls, there's SOAP calls, there's EJB calls, there's JMS topics or queues. So there's lots of different ways that transactions go into an application. What our agent is doing is it's looking for those transaction entry points, and as the transaction comes in, it has intelligence built in to say, okay, this is how I'm going to categorize this transaction. So you're taking URL, an HTTP request that hits a servlet endpoint. We look at the URL. By default, we take the first 2 segments of the URL. We call that the business transaction name. Sometimes that's not a good naming convention, and so for this example specifically, one of the things that I did was I said, you know what, for our naming, we actually want to use the first 3 segments of the URI. So the first 2 segments, it was a REST service, so it was like ticket/WS web services, and it didn't give any visibility into what the actual service was that was running. So I said, instead of the first 2, we'll use the first 3, and then by doing that, now your business transactions look like this. So this is the JBoss ticketing system. So I've got booking, I've got events, I've got venues. Those are the services that exist in my application. Those services are now my business transactions. So as your system starts to degrade, you can very quickly use AppDynamics to say, here are my business functions that are executing. We have scored them. So it's an analytics approach to say, here's kind of that normal good performance. Here's how things should go. as performance degrades away, we start to store those transactions as being degraded. This one's degraded to the point where it's at a warning level, or this one's degraded to the point where it's at a critical level. And then it's very easy now to come in and say, hey, it looks like I've got 5% of my transactions over the last 15 minutes that are running very slow. Well, what about the last hour? Well, it still looks like about 5, maybe 6% of my transactions are very slow. Let's go take a look at those very slow transactions. So what we're doing here is, in real time, the agent is looking at that transaction activity. It's using that scoring to say, hey, this is bad. In real time, this transaction, this experience is degraded. Let's grab a snapshot of it. So it's a very intelligent decision to say, if I've got, let's just say, for example, you're serving 1 million transactions an hour. At PayPal and eBay, we used to have, it was about 10 billion transactions a day. Some systems would say, I'm going to capture every single transaction. Who cares? Just get it all. What we're doing is we're saying, look, you've got 10 billion transactions a day. Let's get the ones that are the problems, right? And what that allows us to do is, number one, run at very low overhead. So we can kind of conserve the resources to take those deep dive snapshots. But then number two, when you're doing your analysis, you don't have to sift through 10 billion transactions or 1 million transactions. We say, here are the time periods that you're looking at. Here are the transactions that were degraded. Let's go straight to those and figure out what happened. So now you can click on a transaction snapshot, which is a actual user checkout. So a checkout in the system. Here's everything that it did. It took 10.7 seconds. Because we're scoring the transactions against what's healthy, we say, hey, this checkout transaction is very slow. Right? It's not a static threshold. We know what the good performance of checkout is, and this one was very slow. We can see all the time that was taken across the tiers. And across any of the tiers, we can drill into and see source line of code. So you see what happened? This was the front-end e-commerce web tier. And what it did was it made 2 web service calls. All right, we had our inventory and our order processing services. So we can see that really most of the time was spent in our inventory service, in this call specifically. So I can drill into downstream call. Now I've jumped across to my downstream JVM. Because I'm correlating the tiers, I can see, okay, this transaction, this is exactly what it did. All right, I called inventory, I called order processing. This is everywhere that I went. So now we're looking at the call stack for that service right here. And here's where the bottleneck is. Bottleneck is in execute query. And if I click on JDBC, I can see that, remember, our total time for this was 14 seconds. I'm spending 10 of those seconds executing this SQL. And here's the exact SQL that was executed.
What about a heap dump of the entire virtual machine at that time?
So if we want to look at heap utilization, so we wouldn't.
I mean, actually, a heap dump of all of the threads.
Yeah. So we wouldn't do heap dumps because heap dumps is so here's the problem with heap dumps. Number one, you have to trigger that. Number two, as your JVM starts to degrade, it's very possible that the JVM cannot process a request for a heap dump. It happens all the time. Different JVMs have different problems actually accepting a command to take a heap dump. The IBM JVM, you can send a _3, it'll give you a heap dump. Oracle JVMs 1.7, it won't give you one. There's no defined way to do that. Plus, that's a very reactive command. So what we're doing for heap utilization is actually looking at, so here's our infrastructure performance monitoring. But we're constantly monitoring heap utilization inside of the JVM. So rather than reactively getting that data, hey, I've got a problem, let's take a heap dump, we're monitoring it 24/7.
Oh, that JDBC call?
Yeah.
Can you actually correlate that to the code?
Yep. So here's the call. So when you come into a transaction snapshot, you start with a call graph. So here's everything that happened to process that transaction request within this JVM. Here's my full call stack. And so you can see, you can go up, all the way across the code. So I'm using Spring. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I can. I can't see any further. Oh yeah. So this is execute query, line 45. So this is that application architecture discovery. What are the tiers in my application? How do they communicate with each other? Business transaction profiling. What transactions are being executed by the user? Component deep dive. Down the source line of code. Here's where my bottleneck is. Here's my exact SQL statement. Right? That's pretty powerful. And it took us running one command that took about 30 seconds. Right? We didn't have to do anything to get that level of visibility. And so when you're thinking about legacy performance infrastructure monitoring, I know you mentioned writing some Perl scripts or parsing log files. I'm not sure exactly what, or using site scope for legacy infrastructure monitoring, having to do a lot of configuration. The old days of standing up an ITCAM-based solution that took almost a year. I mean, it took us about 5 minutes. Right? And that's kind of the goal of where we, I think that's where people want to be. Right? They want to innovate, they want to modernize their business functionality. Right? So this is a really important part of that, is having the ability to understand what's happening in the system, when it's happening, what business transactions are running, and then when things don't go according to plan, to understand where those failure points are, and then even down to the source line of code, hey, here's the root cause, right? Here's my architecture end to end, and there's the problem.
Well, how much data is being collected over what period of time can you maintain? Meaning, for example, if I wanted to see what this looked like now compared to a month ago or 6 months ago or something, I assume it's just configurable as to how much of this metric, how many of these metrics to keep.
Yeah, so out of the box, I know it's small, so maybe you can't see it, although this is a gigantic view. We keep a year's worth of data. That would be the default. And there's a lot of use cases to be able to do things like, let me take a look at my releases. So comparing releases functionality.
Was that the ability to overlay, for example, to see here's what's happening now during the same period a month ago or 6 months ago in prior release to compare the.
We use this. This is awesome. It's called compare releases. I think that the original intent was to say, I'm putting out a new release. How does it compare to my old code base? You get a KPI view right out of the box, key performance indicators. Here's everything that happened. But this is great for pre-prod load testing as well.
By component.
It can be by component. So right now you're looking at everything that happened in the application, but you could very easily say, you know what, really, I want a comparison of this transaction, a checkout transaction, or it could be, let's look at, a comparison of this tier or this node. So different ways of slicing and dicing the data. But the root of it is, what was it before, what is it now? Or was it across these two different periods? We talked a little bit about dashboards. One of those lessons learned from healthcare.gov was that we didn't really have a good sense for what was really happening in the business. So you go into network operations centers. I don't know how many people have gotten the chance, or I've worked with Knox in the past. You see these kinds of things all over the wall. And these are really useful to a lot of people, just to be able to see, hey, here's all the disparate metrics that I care about. Here's my CPU utilization. Here's my call counts. Here's my transactions, but I don't want a single pane of glass. Any questions?
Can you watch for an exception, certain type of exception?
Yep.
Like an I/O exception,
yep.
Especially at a certain command.
Yeah. So I was working with a customer a couple weeks ago, and they said, hey, you know what? One of our biggest problems is that our developers use our session objects as caching mechanisms. It's really easy to take a session, stuff data in there, and now it's cached and available. But the problem is that when we go to serialize that session, we get a lot of not serializable exceptions. And what happens at that point is the user actually gets kicked out of our system. They have to log back in. So you imagine the user experience of, I'm trying to serialize something, well, your user doesn't know that, and all of a sudden he gets kicked out of the site, he's got to log back in. So that was like a Sev1 issue that they wanted to identify. And what you can do is you can set up health policies to say, so out of the box, you're going to get lots of health policies. Health policies are things like, caveat this with, we don't really like static thresholds. There's a lot of problems inherently with those. Just to say things like, if my response time is greater than 3 seconds, throw an alert. There's a lot of problems with that approach. You can get alert storms, you can get false positives. Static thresholds, and what should happen changes across the day too. Your threshold at 9 o'clock in the morning is usually different than your threshold at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? So things kind of shift. So out of the box, you're going to get a lot of the ability to define a lot of health policies, a lot of things like my response time is greater than this many standard deviations away from that good period of performance, then send an alert in. And one of the alerts of the health policies that you can define is when I see this exception, now I want to indicate I want an alert. And the alerts can come through. You can integrate. You can send those out over email. We integrate with PagerDuty, ServiceNow, ticketing systems. Lots of ways that you can kind of.
We've had two types of problems. One of them is full garbage collection with the new parallel VM.
Okay.
It's more rare, but when it happens, sometimes it goes up to 3. That's not so bad. But if it's gone to like 100, then you're sort of going off the deep end at that point, because the next thing you know, it'll be 200, 300.
200.
Yeah, so you could probably do an alert that would scale. It would have an allowance for 3, 10, or something over a period, especially over a period of time. But
so that's actually one of our out-of-the-box alerts. Is when garbage collection is too high, and if you go and look at this under the covers. We have warning conditions and critical conditions. So, a lot of this is designed to get you, remember that maturity model of APM level 2 is I'm actually understanding that I'm about to have a really fatal problem before I get to that fatal problem, right? So that proactive recognition.
And the other one I was telling Ken about was too many file handles.
Yeah.
So we increased the file handles to 8,000, which
still
probably
pretty low.
still isn't enough.
Yeah.
But once you start getting that, things might start, even one of those maybe, things might be really getting better.
If you get out of file handle exceptions, and 8,000 is extremely low to run for JBoss, you're almost dead in the water, because pretty much everything you do opens up a file descriptor under the covers. All right, creating a new socket, that's a file descriptor. Loading a class into memory, that's actually a file descriptor. If you look at JBoss modules and how many modules are loaded by the class loader, I think that we used to run, and then it's probably a little different for everybody, but I want to say it's like 2,000 to 4,000 open files just for starting JBoss up. That's not actually doing anything.
Now, is that because you're getting slow network clients or network clients that are not closing?
That can happen. There was a defect in JBoss where you could get into a scenario where you could open a socket and then it would not get closed. And there's a lot of logic built into the HTTP listeners that if you look at the connectors and standalone.xml, you can see there's lots of different ways to tweak the model of how connections are made. But it can happen.
Can you monitor for extremely slow clients? Like one of the things that HA Proxy does, I don't know if you monitor that. One of the neat things about HA Proxy is it can actually tell you every single piece of that connection. It can tell you like how long it took for the client to connect, how long it took. It just has like a 5-stage monitoring in it. It would be kind of neat if this product could delve into that level of detail and like tell you there's a couple of clients on the AT&T cellular 3G network that are just really occupying your connections, with extremely slow client types of scenarios.
So I don't have any data for this environment. So this is one of our demo environments, and I don't have any mobile data right now, but that's exactly what we do. So we can look at the carriers and say across AT&T, across Verizon, this is your experience across different carriers. This is our end user experience. So this is from an end user perspective, where your end users are coming from. They're using geolocation to say, okay, here's my experience in Australia, Singapore, Japan. Here are all the pages that are being hit. Here's my web response time versus my mobile response time. So I mentioned those 3 levels of monitoring. And user experience, which is browser-based, as well as mobile, application, and then back-end database.
That's not really what I was asking. I was asking, they could be right across the street, but can you analyze the characteristics of the network connections to the actual server?
So, well, I think I understand your question, but let me know. So let's take a look at, here are the pages.
So you just picture like a slow loris, an inadvertent slow loris type of attack, but it's really not an attack, it's just somebody on a really slow network.
Okay.
And they're connecting, but it's taking them a long time to send their data, or it's taking them a long time to download your data.
Right. So I think that would be, so if we look at this is end user experience for a specific page, fetch catalog in this case. End user experience is almost 3 seconds. Here you've got your server connection time, your DNS lookup time, your TCP connection time, right? And then breaking it down into what's your server time, what's the time on the client side to actually build the DOM, so your rendering time. So you've got kind of that client side rendering, building the DOM, DNS lookups, network performance, all the way down to your application.
So we would just put that on our JavaScript library on our page when we build our application?
There's 2 ways that it works. With there's a lot of different rendering engines, and if you have a Jasper compiled page, so like a JSP for some platforms, then we'll just
like
do it for
jQuery,
you.
like we have jQuery page.
So
just plug it in there.
So yeah, you just plug it in. There's a little piece of JavaScript, and you just plug it in. It's like this long. It's like 60 characters, super small. And then that enables AppDynamics to give you this, full printout of here's exactly what your users are experiencing across
JavaScript. How does it send the data back up to the server? Does it send data back up to my server?
Yeah. So
source.
That's part of what the JavaScript agent does. Is essentially the JavaScript that you put into the page loads an end user management JavaScript, but it works in parallel with your page. So the way that the navigation timing API works is that it provides callbacks for performance metrics. So if you think of your user saying, I want this page, and then all this stuff happening to fulfill that request, then your navigation timing API is kind of sitting over here saying, hey, I got a request. Hey, I'm getting these resources. Okay, I'm doing a DNS lookup. So it's callback based. You're getting all that information in parallel to that original page request. And then once the agent has the full picture, then the agent sends the data back to the controller.
So does the controller have to be on the same server? Doesn't it have to be on the same origin server that they could loaded the page from?
So no, the user just has to have, right now, and this is changing, we're about to have a major product release. We do 4 releases per year, seasonal releases. Our next release, the architecture will be the JavaScript goes straight to your controller. And so all that needs to happen is you just need to be able to get that network request from your controller.
So it's like a CORS, like CORS, where you can go to another server.
Yeah.
Each browser will allow you to go to another server.
Yeah, and I don't know, I haven't, we're going out there pretty soon to get like the full technical briefing, so I'm not 100% sure of how it'll work. Okay. Right now, today, all of the traffic goes to an endpoint in Amazon. So within Amazon's CloudFront, there's a server that kind of gets all that data and then funnels it down.
Okay, but you will know at the end of the day. I'm sorry, my last question. You'll know at the end of the day. You'll know why your user was experiencing slow.
You'll know why your user, exactly what your user was doing, what he experienced, why it was slow, and then if you have the application server agent, you could even say, you know what? Hey, this one took 28 seconds. What happened on the application side? So you can correlate to the transaction snapshots in the backend data center. So it's pretty cool.
How about memory leak?
So memory leak. So we were looking at, let's take one of our nodes. Within the context of a transaction snapshot, I showed you how you could say, well, what was happening within the JVM at that point in time. If we go to any of our nodes, we can access the same screen. You see there's this button here that says automatic leak detection. So what you would do is you would click that, and then you would say, turn this, and I don't have permissions to do this in this environment, but let's do it in my OpenShift environment. I think all my nodes have gone away because they've elastically scaled down. You would say, okay, I want to turn on leak detection, and I don't have permissions. It says demo user doesn't have permissions to do that. you would turn on leak detections, then you would say, I want to run leak detection for the next 10 to 60 minutes, and then we will automatically analyze the collections and the things in your application that can contribute to heap leaks or growth. There's not really such a thing as a leak in Java, but growth. And it'll tell you, hey, you've got, the problem with the challenges to diagnosing heap leak in Java is understanding, is it an under-provisioned environment? Do you have capacity issues, or do you truly have a leak? And so what this does is it tries to statistically make that determination. Am I actually leaking memory? Am I growing unboundedly? Or is it just a capacity issue? But it'll highlight, come back, and if you ever use something like Eclipse MAT, with the memory analyzer toolkit, which is, it's a good solution. I've used it before, but it's very manual. You have to, you have to get.
J-hat.
What's that?
J-hat.
Yeah.
Heap analysis.
Yeah. See, that works
Same
on
thing.
page profiles. So it's very manual. You have to take core dumps and you have to transfer them over. They can be enormous. It can be a real problem just getting it. And then did you get it at the right time? Like, can you compare it to what was happening? So there are a lot of challenges in doing that static heap analysis. So this, you just press a button and you say, run it for the next 10 to 60 minutes and then come back and it'll show you basically your dominators, similar to the dominator view. Hey, these are all the things in memory that were consuming heap. This is really where you want to go and look to solve problems.
And these are the classes that were consuming the most percentages.
Yep. Okay, so maybe to kind of start to wrap up a little bit. One of the takeaways, I think one of the takeaways for me for a long time has been, if your system has any level of complexity, I think that something like this is just a requirement, in today's world. Right? And it just, yes, I think David made the point. Before he knew that I worked for AppDynamics, he came in and said, "It better be good because it costs a lot of money, right?" But it doesn't cost that much money. But the value that it brings to the organization is enormous. And we're working with a lot of people who have decided to go that route. And I think that the capabilities that it provides is well worth the investment. The time that it takes to write a Perl script, to try to fight with JConsole, to use Visual VM, use Eclipse MAT, to take heap dumps. Can I get the heap dump across the network? That's not free, right? And so, I think that as your environments start to grow in complexity, start to become more distributed, you start to think about what are the innovations that I can make from a business standpoint. And part of the discussion should be, well, how can I make sure that those innovations are available to my users? All right? And so I've spent all this time developing those. How am I actually going to run the system? And what happens when something goes wrong? Because stuff is going to happen. It happens in every system. Right? How am I going to be responsible for dealing with those challenges? So I appreciate you guys coming out. If you have any more questions, I'm more than happy to stay after and talk.
I think, by the way, cost-wise is also a factor in. What does it cost to develop your own, roll your own, design your own? Figure out the entire life cycle associated with what it takes to decide what you're going to monitor, how you're going to monitor it, who's going to develop it, then put it in. All those things together are part of the inherent cost of rolling your own, basically.
It's definitely a trade-off. And then if you look at it and say, well, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna build my own, or I'm gonna stitch these tools together. And then at the end of the day, do I have 10% of the capabilities? Do I have 25%? Like what capabilities, what value do I have after I've made that investment, right? And because all of those things that you've lost, right, that's going to cost you money down the road too.
To roll your own, you have to have people that know what to do, how to do it, the best way to do it, or use a tool that somebody who's an expert already gone through all that.
Yeah, I've always been a proponent of buy, either open source or buy versus build, and there's nothing in the open source world that does this. Yeah, you look at Nagios, or you look at some of the profilers that are available. There's just huge gaps.
Not only that, but from the business side of things, as one of the sales guys are watching us online, you will notice that we just announced another funding round, actually about 2 days ago, that valued the company at $1 billion.
big.
started, 1 billion. We started in 2008. Our product was first GA in 2010. I'm a longer than tooth guy. I've been here for 2 years. When I started, we were valued at 500 million. Now it's $1 billion. We're growing 10%.
So you brought 500 million worth of value to the company?
Well, I would say more. I would argue more than that. But we split it 500. But the point being is that we're addressing a major gap in the market. We talk about like the cost versus building your own. The cost. I mean, it's more than that. I mean, a major shipping company in the South just paid us $8 million for this. A major cable company on the East Coast pays $6 million for this stuff. So they're not doing that just because they don't want their guys rolling their own. They're doing that because the software defines their business, and if it goes out, that's like money flying out the window, right? So this has got real business impact beyond just bits and bytes. So anyhow, there's a bunch of information on the website. There's a couple sales guys here, but if you guys want to just check it out here, go to AppDynamics.com.
Yeah, I've got cards. I'll give you guys all my contact information if you just want to talk some technical stuff. I've got a GitHub repo that has this example. You can do a free self-service trial. Although I think it was a really good analogy that was made. If somebody handed me a Ferrari and told me I could go out and drive it, I'd still probably take them up on driving lessons first. Right? So we're more than happy to kind of work with you and say, okay, this is what you're trying to get accomplished. This is what you want to do. It goes a lot. It goes a lot easier that way. But it is available. I'll be more than happy to share the code for all this. Yeah. I can't talk about it.
So
You're heavy on the sales side.
What's that?
I said you're heavy on the sales side.
He told me he was going to buy me beer after this.
Yeah.
Oh, so now
But we have to
really.
get out of here soon because I got to cover you. So another great thing about AppDynamics, since we're still in the virtues, but I come from a big legacy background, CA, using CA, BMC, where pricing was kind of a mystery, right? You can go to AppDynamics.com/pricing. It's all right there.
Cool.
We're very transparent about that. But just to answer your question in this environment here,
If I can look it up.
it's a subscription, annual subscription. Each JVM requires an agent. Obviously, when you're in the OpenShift world, there's some elasticity, some metering that goes on there. So that's a little kind of side special. But it's about $3,000 an agent a year. And that's for production. For dev, you get a handful for free on your first purchase, and then on move forward, they're 50% of the value of the production. So, but it's all on / pricing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that developers should have access to and be aware of it. So as they're doing their own development, again, this isn't something that you just use in the production environment. It needs to be available at the level of the person who can most influence it the earliest in the process.
Right.
Performance.
Well, it's one, even though we have different licensing for production versus development, it's one UI.
Yeah, that's what
We have enterprise grade, user authentication, and we look at LDAP and all that, so you can decide who sees what, but it's one UI, right? So hey, DevOps, they love that. And we also have, by the way, some really cool purse backpack things over here.
First call. We prefer to call it versus.
That's purse. If you need, something to put your, I don't know, junk at some sort.
Kids, as they go to camp and waters or whatever.
We need to innovate on the straggler.
I know. We got a little lax on it.
Good with that money first.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate it very much. It's very informative. I think that there's a lot of detail in it that is fascinating to see what's possible. Yeah. That's the other part of it. So we appreciate it very much.
Thanks, guys.
I'll take your
Thank you.
business
Yeah,
card.
nice to meet you.